Dozens of villagers are slaughtered in central Mali, just 3 months after a similar attack. The cycle of violence is being blamed largely on tensions between ethnic rivals fighting for land and resources. But what's behind these attacks, and why can't Mali's government protect its people? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine. Now, ethnic tension is threatening to further destabilise Mali. Violence is worsening in the long-running dispute between the Dogon and the Fulani peoples. And armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda are exploiting this. A village home to Dogon farmers was attacked by men armed with machetes and guns. At least 95 people were killed. Sunday's attack is remarkably similar to the ransacking of a Fulani village. That was in March, and where nearly 160 people died. Nicholas Huck has more now from Mali's capital, Bamako.
The silence is deafening. The smell of dead bodies hangs low in the air. The attack on the Dogon village of Subanoku started at dusk and went on deep into the night. Few survived, hiding as their loved ones were being killed.
They immediately encircled the village and shot at everything that moved. So everywhere people were screaming, children were screaming, who tried to run were shot down.
The survivors believe they know who the killers are. It is their Fulani neighbors, they say. Both communities have been fighting each other for control over land. Armed groups have called on Fulanis to join their ranks, accusing the government of backing Dogon militias. Ethnic tension is at breaking point, with each community calling for revenge attacks. In this spiral of violence, both communities are fleeing their homes. It is in this open-air slaughterhouse on the outskirts of the capital that some Fulanis have sought refuge. All of the people living under this tent share one bowl of rice and millet a day. Children show clear sign of malnutrition. There's not enough water to go around, so there's a threat of waterborne diseases. This is where they sleep, eat, and cook. Despite the calls for peace, Fulanis continue to be the victims of violence. President Ibrahim Qaeda says the country's national unity is under threat.
I would like to call on all our brothers to keep calm and stay rational more than ever.
While the 14,000 UN soldiers and Malian forces on the ground failed to prevent these killings, Dogon hunters called this latest attack on their community a declaration of war, saying revenge will come. Nicholas Hawk, Al Jazeera, Bamako, Mali.
Well, there are many layers to this inter-ethnic conflict. The Fulani are nomadic herders who mostly raise cattle, while the Dogon, they are mainly farmers. They've clashed for generations over grazing land and resources. Groups like Tuareg separatists, Al-Qaeda and ISIL have all exploited these tensions to expand their own influence. In 2013, French and other African troops entered Mali to try to restore stability. Around 4,000 French soldiers remain, and 14,000 UN peacekeepers are in northern Mali. Mali's government in the capital Bamako has often been described as weak and ineffective. Now, here's what the chief of the Dogon people in Mali told Al Jazeera.
Every community accuses the other community because we really don't know, first, why these attacks are going on and who attacks. If a Dogon is attacked, he say that it's the Fulani job. If a Fulani is attacked, they say it is the Dana Amasagu, the Dogon hunters. And the government is not capable of playing fully its role.
Right, let's introduce our panel now. In Niamey, the Nigerian capital, we have Ibrahim Ibrahim. He's a consulting analyst with the International Crisis Group. In London, Paul Melly, a consulting fellow at Chatham House, an international affairs think tank. And in Oslo, the Norwegian capital, we have Tor Benjaminsen, a professor of political ecology at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Thank you to you all. Let me come to you first, Ibrahim, in Niamey. This is a complex conflict, isn't it, as we've just alluded to. Tensions between the different ethnic groups have been there for as long as there have been settlements. Why are we experiencing an upsurge in violence now in recent years?
Well, thank you very much. This is really a good question. There have been tension between Dogons and the Fulanis since centuries ago. These tensions have evolved over time, got exacerbated because of the tension over natural resources, control over natural resources, but particularly in the last 5 to 6 years, because of the upsurge of jihadist insurgency in the region, the Dogon, most of the jihadists are associated with Pearl, Fulanis, and the jihadists, the Dogon thought that they needed to protect themselves from violence perpetrated by the jihadists, and some of them created militias, and they used those militias in order to...
Ibrahim, I don't want us to go too far ahead in this. I'm trying to go through this step by step because it is such a complex situation that we're trying to analyse. Let me now go to Tor in Oslo. And Tor, give us an idea, briefly, if you will, about the conditions in central Mali that the various communities are experiencing. Ibrahim has referred to there being diminishing resources and that obviously exacerbating tensions between groups.
Well, actually, the Sahel, including central Mali, has been greening during the last decade. So I don't think there is a situation of general diminishing resources. That's not the cause of this. It's the cause. The causes are political, and the causes are related to the general crisis, the general political crisis in Mali. It's true that there have been tensions between these groups for decades, if not centuries, but there has been cooperation as well. And the situation has never been as bad between these groups as what we see now. So this is related to the general political crisis in Mali that started in 2012, which has, and I think the causes are quite well known. There are, in my opinion, there are at least 4 causes. The general bad governance and corruption that has increased in Mali during the last decade or two. There is the spillover effect from the civil war in Algeria that led jihadist groups to move into northern Mali in the early 2000s, leading to hijacking of Westerners and increased drug trafficking through the Sahara. And there is the fallout of the NATO bombing in Libya in late 2011, which led a large number of Tuareg soldiers employed in Gaddafi's army to move back to Mali heavily armed. So that's the general background that we need to understand these conflicts with.
Let's come to you, Paul. So Tor has already flagged up what the contributory factors are to this conflict. Tell us about the poor government policies. I mean, development aid is critical, isn't it, for this region, well, for the whole country, actually. Why has the government been so ineffective in delivering development aid?
Well, the government has really not been able or not managed to restore effective state services in the centre of Mali ever since the crisis really reached its peak in 2011-12 with the jihadist takeover of the far north. And although the area of central Mali that we're talking about today is outside of the zone that the jihadists actually occupied, it's very close to it, and it was highly destabilized by the after effects of that conflict. And as Tor mentioned, the circulation of weapons and also the influence of the jihadist groups. Some of them in the north linked up with Amadou Koufa, a preacher, actually in central Mali. And in that sort of climate, it's been very insecure, and the state has really struggled to re-establish effective services or even effective security. For several years now, military posts, local police posts, local officials providing public services have regularly been targeted with killings and also with threats, so that many officials have preferred to retreat to the main towns or even to Bamako, feeling that it was too unsafe to remain in post. So the state has got weaker, and that's left us a bit of a gap so that the structures in which public services could be provided, or justice for resolving disputes, the administration that could sort out some of the long-standing competition over resources, which is inevitable in any Sahelian country, that state structure has just crumbled away, and there's been quite weak political leadership from President Keita.
All right. Weak political leadership coming from President Keita Ibrahim in Niamey. But there are what, 14,000, 18,000 international troops, both UN and French, stationed in Mali, not to mention the Malian army itself. Why can't they protect the people of this country?
But, well, first of all, the international forces are deployed mostly in the north. So the MINUSMA forces, the UN peacekeeping forces that they are largely operated to stabilize the northern part of the country that has been in crisis since 2012. Now there is discussions in New York about expanding the operations or intensifying operations of the UN peacekeeping missions in the center. But we have to wait and see how this would operate, because there are a lot of other issues that need to be sorted out. There are French forces that are also operating in the region, but also focusing on the north. Now they are called for them to engage in the central part of the region, but there are reluctance about expanding their activities, because all these forces have limited capacity. They cannot continue to stretch themselves over large territories because there is a risk of them to not be effective anywhere. The Malian army also had a lot of logistic problems. So we see that the tension is popping up in different places throughout the central part of the region, and the focus of the international community is in the north, and the Malian government is unable to stabilize the center because of the logistical issues.
Right. Paul, would it be fair to say that resolving the situation in Mali, OK, not an easy thing, but would it be fair to say that it is being hindered by the fact that it's being viewed through the prism of the so-called war on terror, the fight against extremists? I mean, that's certainly how the French see the situation in Mali, isn't it?
I think they certainly do see it in those terms as far as the situation in the far north is concerned. But I think Ibrahim is right to point out that these international forces up to now have been very heavily concentrated in the north, and specifically on fighting jihadist groups. It's quite and of course with MINUSMA, the UN peacekeeping force, trying to maintain the balance between the former separatists, former Tuareg separatists, and militias favourable to the Malian government. And all of that was in the north, shifting their emphasis to a much more hearts and minds civil engagement process of policing and stabilisation in the centre of the country, which is more densely populated, is a quite different task. I don't think it would be fair to say that they've been trying to apply aggressive anti-terrorism tactics in the centre. They haven't. People are aware of that risk. So it's not so much a case of a sort of simplistic war on terror approach. It's just that up to now, the French focus has been on war on terror. The UN focus has been on what you would call post-conflict peacekeeping and protecting its own forces against attacks, for example, roadside bombs and that kind of thing in the north. And shifting to a much wider stabilization and peace-building mission in the center of the country is a very different ask, especially when you're trying to not undermine the authority and the capacity of the already very weak Malian state. There have been interviews, for example, with French forces in recent media coverage where they've pointed out that they don't want to replace the Malian state. They don't want to create a situation where local communities assume that the government is unable to do anything and that only international forces can provide security. So it's a really difficult balance to strike.
Right, OK. Tor, it sounds very much as though from the year 2012 that the crisis in Mali has morphed, it's changed, and that the response, both domestic, both local and international, has not responded with it, and it's lagging so far behind, and it's civilians who are paying the price.
I just wanted to add that it's difficult to imagine a way out of this impasse in Mali without actually there being negotiations between the government and the various rebel groups, and then including all rebel groups, also the various jihadist groups. Now, as this is framed as a fight against terrorism, there is a reluctance, both within the Malian government, although I've seen that the new Minister of Foreign Affairs now is in favor of actually negotiating with the jihadists. But the president and most of the government has been against negotiating with the jihadists, as has also the international community been. And I think that, even though it's painful, I think that would probably need to change.
Right.
And most of these people who join this organization, they are not fanatical, they are not there for religious reasons. They are therefore basically to sustain their livelihoods, to survive. It's linked to a struggle for and control over resources rather than religious jihadism.
Right. This is, Ibrahim, coming back to you, this is a scenario that we've seen in other parts of the region. I'm thinking particularly of Nigeria and recruitment to Boko Haram ranks. This is about young men, for the most part, who need a future, basically. You, the International Crisis Group, I think that you also support the idea of dialogue, that think that the government needs to enter into some sort of dialogue. But tell me, if there is this reluctance to engage with some of the groups involved, some of the groups who want a separate state, an Islamic state, what on earth do they have to negotiate about?
That's a very good question. We just published a report last week about calling for government to engage in dialogue with these groups. And the reason why we thought that dialogue is necessary, because there are any good options to deal with. And the situation is getting worse. The attack of Sobame 2 days ago is a good evidence of that. So in the lack of good options, we think that dialogue is a possible way to open up new opportunities, because right now we are stuck. We are in a situation of mutually hurting stalemate between the government and the jihadists. Now, what to dialogue about? We think that, first of all, it is the idea of opening the dialogue, and then thinking about ways of compromise between the position of the jihadists, which is to consider the Malian state institutions as un-Islamic, to consider the relationship with the Western countries as also un-Islamic and need to be changed, and considering Muslims who do not agree with them on certain issues to be not Muslim enough. So they are calling to establish Sharia rule in central Mali, and we know that the Malian government is deeply engaged, is deeply engaged in democracy and in protecting its constitution. But we think that there are ways that on both sides we can find compromises. For example, the idea of having Qadi, an Islamic judge, ruling over certain issues, which is already things that are ongoing in the ground. Most people today in Mopti prefer to go to the traditional judge, which is the Qadi, rather than go to the judge, the government judge. So we think that reform in the justice system that consider a Qadi in certain capacity to rule over certain things is a good compromise that could be acceptable on both sides. We also consider that Quranic school, reform of Quranic school in Mopti region can be something that is welcomed by both sides, and both sides could benefit from it. Those are only few ideas that we put forward
Mm.
in order to kick off those discussions.
Ibrahim,
Now,
have you had any response? Sorry to interrupt. Have you had any response from the government yet?
Yes, we did. The Malian, 2 days after the publication of the report, the Malian government, one of the ministers in the Malian government, came out and said that the government is ready to engage in dialogue with the jihadists and considering options in order to engage with them.
OK, Paul, so a slight note of optimism, perhaps, coming from Ibrahim and the International Crisis Group. But underpinning all of this seems to be a profound disconnect, if you like, between the state and the people. The government itself has got to reconnect with its population. Do you think that there is an awareness and a capacity for the government in Bamako to do this?
I think there is certainly more capacity than there was, because one of the things that was striking in the Mali crisis back in 5 or 6 years ago, when the jihadists took over the north, was that although Mali had been seen as a model democracy by the international community and in fact by the rest of West Africa, actually state authority crumbled very easily in the north. Election turnouts in many parts of the country had been falling. There was a sense that if you like, the political elite, the administrative elite, technocratic people in Bamako had lost touch with the needs and concerns of people very much at local level. And for several years after the French intervention, when the jihadists were pushed back in the north, the Malian government didn't really seem to evolve very much. There wasn't much sense of a recognition of the need to really change the system. But in the last year or so, there has been more of a recognition, and we've now just seen recently the formation of what is almost a national government, with the main opposition parties agreeing, or the main opposition alliance agreeing to come into the government. So the new foreign minister, for example, was one of the fiercest critics of President Qaeda hitherto. And we have a new prime minister who seems to grasp the need for a much more deep-seated effort to try and get government properly engaged. And that may, because there was a notable lack of political leadership, probably from about 2012, certainly from 2013 through to about 2016, the government seemed distant and seemed to think that the northern crisis was really the affair of the international forces, and didn't really seem to recognise too much that there was a crisis in the centre of Mali. That's now changed.
Tor, coming to you now, there does seem to have been a heavy dependence upon military responses to the various crises in Mali. Do you think it's helpful to have the presence of so many foreign forces in the country? I know that the G5 combination is meant to deal with the region, not just Mali, but there are a lot of foreign forces in the country, and does that help?
I think the foreign military intervention was probably necessary in order to support a very weak Malian army. But the solution to the crisis is not military. It's as I said, it's negotiations between all groups. And if you look at, for instance, the speeches, if you listen to the speeches by a person like Amadou Koufa, who's probably the main jihadist leader in the central Mopti region, he talks very little about establishing an Islamic state, or he talks very little about religion, actually. He talks about the fight against corruption. He talks about injustice. You might say that that's a way of tapping into a local anti-elite, anti-state discourse. But in any way, I think negotiations should be tried. And then you find out what these organizations actually want. It's not necessary that they actually are, going for an Islamic state.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed. Tor Benjaminsen talking to us from Oslo, Paul Melly in London, and Yahaya Ibrahim. Thank you all very much indeed. And As ever, thank you for watching the programme. You can see it again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. Should you want more discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Join us also on the Twitter sphere, our handle @AJ Inside Story. I'm @Martine Dennis. From me and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.